Welcome to another episode of Health Creators. This is Liv, and I'm joined here today with Amisha, founder and CEO of Clicks. Today, we are going to be discussing how ADHD can be a secret superpower. But first of all, Amisha, can you give us your elevator pitch on Clicks?
Yeah. So the problem that we have at the moment and that we're seeing in general is that ADHD diagnosis is incredibly qualitative, and reporting on it differs between lots of different parties. So teachers, parents, doctors have different opinions on the symptoms and the presentations of ADHD. So what we're trying to do with Clicks is provide a more quantitative method of recording data to provide more weight to an ADHD diagnosis in lots of different ways.
So Amisha, you're currently in medical training. Can you tell us a little bit more about what ADHD actually is and how it impacts our brains?
Yeah, so there's three main things that are associated with ADHD. So those are hyperactivity, inattention, and impulsivity. And so lots of people may present with symptoms of each of those traits in general in their daily lives. But what differentiates ADHD from just people in general, like suffering with hyperactivity or like not being able to concentrate on their exams or studying, is that it has a significant impact on your daily life. So it might affect your diet, it might affect your relationships with people, it might affect your ability to study in a really like chronic, significant way.
Why is that?
So we're not exactly sure on the biomechanics because it can present, with a lot of mental health conditions, the way that it presents on a biochemical level can vary significantly.
Interesting.
And so sometimes you might not actually see any differences, for example, on scans. And in general, you won't, because there is so little research in that field. It's more looking at how does it affect someone's daily life and how do they feel. So there's no kind of underlying scientific evidence.
Weird.
Or test, yeah.
So we diagnose it based off of like behavior, but there's no actual like physiological change that causes
Exactly.
ADHD.
Yeah, exactly. So there's no test that we can do to say like 100% this person has ADHD. And so for that reason, it's that like the difference in diagnosis between clinicians can be very different. And that's a massive area of research as well, is that if you take one person to 5 different psychiatrists, often they will not all give you the same diagnosis.
Interesting. So do you see ADHD almost like an umbrella term, and then people kind of like anyone who has any difficulties with those topics just kind of get like bucketed into the ADHD group, but it could actually be different problems within?
Yeah. I don't think ADHD in itself is an umbrella term. So what you'd say is an umbrella term is something like attention deficit.
Yeah.
So you'd say somebody's struggling with attention, what's the cause for it? With ADHD in particular, it first presents in childhood. So a big part of the diagnosis is saying that somebody, like people have to show that they were presenting with these symptoms when they were children. It can't just be something that has started up as an adult. They have to, in most cases, always have it. Yeah.
So when we're looking at people who have ADHD, it's usually, have you had this problem since you were a child?
Exactly. And so when we're looking at adult ADHD, often you have to give collaterals from somebody who's known you as a child. So a teacher or a parent who can corroborate what you're saying about what you were like, and because reporting what you were like as a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old is pretty difficult. I don't know if most of us can remember.
And do you find a lot of individuals develop ADHD, or that's not the case?
I don't think that's possible. There are other disorders like ADD, or sometimes people who develop anxiety or other mental health disorders, they can present with symptoms of attention deficit. So I wouldn't say they would present with symptoms of ADHD as a condition, but they might struggle with hyperactivity or inattention.
Yeah.
but they might not necessarily have ADHD.
But if there's no physiological change that causes ADHD, do you not see it as a mental health disorder?
In mental health disorders in general, there's not a lot of evidence that there are physiological changes that we can see with the research that has been done so far. So yeah, I would say it's a mental health disorder.
But why wouldn't it not be able to develop into adulthood then? So it's a mental health disorder that's like that only starts in childhood rather than starts later in life. Like there can't be like a traumatic event that causes you to now have ADHD.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think it's interesting because a lot of medicine in general is like we try and section off conditions. So we say this condition presents like this, and this type of person would have had it since they were a child. So it's not something that is developed. I think, so it's kind of a way of saying this is how we would categorize this condition.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, because there's not a lot of conditions that are rooted in the physiology, right? So it's not like we say, so for example, acute coronary syndrome.
Yeah.
Like heart attacks and MIs. Well, heart attacks are MIs, but we would categorize that by a subset of symptoms. We wouldn't say like physiologically, this is what has to be happening for it to be this. We would just umbrella term it like that. So going back to what you were saying about it's not something that can be developed. So that you can have like kind of exacerbations. So you can have like difficult periods and easier periods for people with ADHD. And the reason why people don't necessarily present with it as children, or you might not present with symptoms, is one, because it is a spectrum, and two, because you might not have ever been in a situation where you've had to push yourself mentally towards kind of symptoms presenting. So for a lot of people, they go into adulthood and they go into like university, which is the first time that a lot of them really start to struggle academically. And then they realize, hang on, like my natural intelligence and the way that I pick up things and the way that I learn isn't enough to compensate for this deficit that I have had for the whole of my life. Because when we're talking about mental health in general, there are so many things that come into play. So like you might have like natural like hyperactivity tendencies or like tendencies towards inattention, but your upbringing and your environment will have such an impact into how that translates into your everyday life. So yeah, I'd say it's pretty complicated.
Interesting. So basically, if you never really have to exert yourself, you may never actually experience ADHD, even if you naturally would have it, like if you had to exert yourself, essentially.
Yeah. But that's not like a blanket thing either, right? So the same way that there are different severities of ADHD, there's also different subsets. So you can have ADHD inattentive subset. You could have ADHD hyperactive type. And you can be more in each of these directions. And so depending on that, you may or may not present with symptoms at different stages of your life.
I find that interesting because back to the root of this conversation, right? Can ADHD be a superpower? The reason why I set that as a topic is actually because a lot of startup founders, because of their jobs, naturally develop this sort of ADHD. Even though we say that ADHD can't be developed, it could be that they were pushed to this, right? And we know that there is a higher tendency for people who are CEOs to have ADHD, to present with it because of the context switching required. It almost feels like ADHD because at any one given time, you have to do 10 different things. And I wanted to kind of get your opinions on that in terms of how that pushing yourself to the limit can almost cause this ADHD-like effect.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because ADHD has been talked about so much in social media currently. And also it's thrown around massively.
Yeah.
So it's like, if I'm doing a million things at once, or I'm having to juggle all of these things, and I'm like, people would say like, I'm acting ADHD.
Yeah.
And in reality, that's very far from what the actual condition is.
Yeah.
I think that we get people who are very high performing presenting with symptoms of ADHD, more because I'm not sure, I'm like a bit hesitant towards like talking about adult ADHD with such a like with so kind of like taking one story for everybody.
Yeah.
And saying like and generalizing, like I'm hesitant towards generalizing ADHD in that way and saying like startup founders are more likely to have ADHD because there's not a lot of evidence towards that.
And ultimately, it is a disability, right? Like
Exactly.
even if people talk about it on media, neurodivergence, etc. Ultimately, it's a disability, and part of that is not being able to perform in your day-to-day.
Yeah, I think in the same way that I'm saying that people might present with it when they first go to university, for a lot of startup founders, you're very high-functioning people, and so actually you might start to struggle at a start, like when you become a founder, not just because it's really difficult. You might have an underlying thing, and this might have been like, because it's so difficult, this might be the thing to bring it out of you and realize like, this, like the way my intelligence should, or like my work ethic and my intelligence should be able to carry me through this, but it's not. And what is that? And I think it's important to think and differentiate. Am I looking for a reason why I can't, or is this just really, really difficult? And like, would the average person even be able to deal with this? You know, because when we're talking about significant impairment, it's all relative. Like, what is significant impairment? And we gauge that by activities of daily living. So, are you struggling to get out of bed? Are you struggling to do things that you should be, like, most people should be able to do? If you're struggling to balance a company, a medical degree, a career in VC, all at the same time, and you're finding that hard, that's not necessarily because you have ADHD. It's just something hard, that's really difficult.
And you mentioned those four things. So that's your life currently, right? So you do Clicks, you're a doctor, you're in VC. Can you talk more about how you've balanced all those things, and do you see a reflection of this kind of breaking point for you? Because I'm guessing for most people, most founders, intelligence and work ethic can get you pretty much far in almost every other career, but sometimes with startups, it's not the case, right? And that could push people past that limit to start being able to not perform their best.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you say that. I think I watched something by YC where they kind of like, they related being a startup founder to being an elite sport, like being in elite sports. I don't know if you've heard about that kind of analogy, where it's like, and I think it's especially like true being a medic, and like, so when you're in academia or you're in a corporate career, you see the relationship between effort and reward. So if you're an intelligent person with like a certain work ethic, there's correlation there, right? You put more in, you get more out. With like elite sports and being an athlete or being a startup founder, you have that effort and reward, but it only takes you to a ceiling. And everything apart from that is like the situation, things that you can't control, right? You know this, like who you talk to at certain points, is like that brings you up, or like the climate at the time, the economic climate. There are so many things, and there's a lot of luck involved as well. And it's like, yeah, I don't know where I'm going on this tangent, but
I know what you mean, because essentially, like, in every other career, you have this input-output effect, right?
Yeah.
That gives you that sense of security, where it's like, I input X, I output Y, right? I know that if I put in this much effort, if I deliver this, then I get this reward. And that's a very nice thing for us as humans, right? That's a very nice thing for our brains. We're like, okay, effort, dopamine. But when you're in an elite sport, or when you're running a startup, it's input and then very variable whether or not you get reward.
Yeah.
And it forces you to essentially look beyond that short-term reward, right? And we talk about ADHD. I wonder if a component of why it comes out in these stressful situations is because you lose that short-term reward. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
So it turns into, I put in effort, I don't get the reward. I put in effort, I still need to, make the process of what I'm doing very good, despite not knowing whether or not I get the reward at the end.
Yeah. And physiologically, that's because of dopamine, right? So we're not getting the dopamine back from the thing that's supposed to give it to us.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting kind of like avenue of conversation, because it kind of brings me back to, I don't know if you read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. So, and it kind of ties into some other conversations I've had. So with the whole effort and reward thing. So Outliers is a book that is about this relationship between effort and reward. In the book, they talk about, I read it a very long time ago, so what I am saying might not be entirely accurate, but the effort and reward is seen in children of immigrant parents.
Yeah.
So it was exploring kind of like, why is it that children come to this country or are born in this country with very little to immigrant parents, and they turn out so successful, and like in a lot of cases out of proportion to what is expected of them.
Yeah.
And it's because they are modeled this idea of effort and reward as children. And so like they see, so one of the examples was an immigrant mother brought her child over, and she worked in the clothing industry.
Yeah.
So the child would kind of see her mother, like the more clothes that she sewed every day, the more money she would make. And so like that translated when he went to study, and then he got that. With startups, you're entirely right.
Yeah.
So like it helps us to that extent. We get to a certain point, and then that whole thing goes out the window. And yeah, you're right. That can make people feel very, very anxious and debilitated.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily ADHD. I think it's something that is modeled to us and has a big impact in getting to that kind of level where we're like a viable founder, because we've done the effort and reward.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that we are like we've got a deficit. It's something that we have to kind of actively think about. And I think therapy is really important in getting through that.
So you think that rather than the essentially stress of the situation causing ADHD, it's more that the lack of effort and reward that happens is leading to anxiety, and that can present like ADHD rather than people actually developing it.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think that another thing feeding into the anxiety of it all is the fact that you are so used to competing. So you're so used to like, okay, if I'm in a cohort of really smart people and I'm keeping up with them, or I'm doing a bit better than them, I'm fine, I'm great.
Yeah.
When you're in the startup world, and it's the same with like elite sports, if you are competing with the people around you, you like, because the rate of success is so low, if you're looking at the people around you and trying to keep up with them, you'll fail. So,
well, you have to compete, right? In a way.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, you're competing always in the market and in the product you're building, for sure. And then there's another element of competition where it's I guess, an unsaid truth, which is your company is valued at a very distinct amount, right? You are Series C, you are A, you are B, you are C. You are not unicorn, you are, right? And I think in that level, there is this like unspoken ranking where it's like you could be in medical school. You're not really competing, but you could be in quartile 1, you could be in quartile 4, you could be number 1 or you could be number 100. And it's not necessarily that you're competing against everyone in your cohort, but you're ranked.
Yeah. But I think that's the difference between being a founder and being at medical school, right? So like, if you rank higher than most people in your cohort, you probably get the job that you want.
But it's the same. If you rank higher than everyone in your cohort, you're a founder, you're a unicorn, or you're not, you get the more funding.
Yeah,
right?
but getting there is not that easy, right? So it's like, what are the metrics that you're competing against? Because none of them are valid, right?
Yeah.
You have to be doing something different. You have to be thinking different to become a unicorn. Because the likelihood that you take your company to IPO is so small that you cannot physically be competing. Because what are you going to win against? Like, you have to be completely different. If you're running a race, like, you better be swimming instead of running. Because
exactly.
The likelihood of you winning by running is so small. Like, you need to find another way.
Exactly. So it's like we're kind of on this ranking system, but there isn't like a defined path of how you rank, essentially, how you get to the rank that you want to get to.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's like if you're looking at the same, so I'm bringing it back to athletes again. If you're looking at people trying to, and I think this was something they were talking about in Outliers as well, but if you're running a race and you are so focused on making your time faster by doing the thing that everybody else is doing. So like, if that's like, for example, like looking at your reaction time when you start the race, everyone's trying to minimize their reaction time when they start the race. And there's only so much that you can go with that. If you do that successfully, you might win by like a small amount.
Yeah.
But if you think about like, what else could I do? Let's just because everybody else is focusing on the reaction time when I first start the race, if I look at like something else completely different, you're more likely to succeed doing that than you are trying to maximize on that tiny aspect that everybody else is trying to maximize on, because everybody else is trying to do it, right?
Yeah. So in terms of this kind of adult ADHD, it seems like what you're saying is that it's very unlikely that all these people have ADHD. It could just be that, they're stressed, essentially, from this process of having to run a startup.
Yeah.
But then I guess my next question would be, you're working on VC, medical school, this startup. Why did you decide to go with ADHD? Because I guess my initial thoughts on that was that you'd probably come here with some story about how you have ADHD and you managed to do 3 things at the same time. But you probably have a different reason for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it started off with what you're saying, right? So it's like I went through medical school. I was in my 3rd year.
Yeah.
I did computer science in my 3rd year at UCL.
Yeah.
Which is entirely different to medicine and incredibly overwhelming. And around that time, I think other people on my cohort also kind of felt that pressure.
Yeah.
And a lot of people around me started, like a significant number of people around me started saying like, I think I have ADHD, like I'm really, really struggling. And that's like myself included. So
yeah.
And then it comes down the line of thinking of like, do I have it? Could I qualify?
Yeah.
And then going through that process and then learning what that process of getting a diagnosis is like and weighing up what are the benefits and the drawbacks of getting a diagnosis. So one of my friends went through with it and he was really struggling, and he really did feel that he had symptoms for a very long time, like going into childhood. The waiting time for an assessment for him, he was quoted 7 years.
Wow.
On the NHS, which was just not a viable option. He needed the extra time and the learning support from uni, and he felt that it was really important. For me, I kind of watched along the journey, and I saw a lot of the questionnaires that he was doing, and I like followed his journey about what the interviews that he had to do were, and I did feel like it seemed to me that it would be very easy to get a diagnosis. I identified with a lot of the questions that usually come up on the questionnaires. So for my co-founder and I, it kind of came from a place of why does it seem like, because it's not just me that feels that, right?
Yeah.
So there's people all over the internet and social media at the moment thinking like, do I have ADHD or do I not? Should I get a diagnosis? Or being newly diagnosed.
You have to wait 7 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So is it worth it? And also, how much is a diagnosis actually worth?
Yeah.
What does it add to my life? Would I get medicated if I were to be diagnosed?
Yeah.
Would the education support available be helpful to me? I think if you're waiting 7 years, and the alternative, most people will not be waiting everybody that I think feels a diagnosis would be necessary, I think the majority of people that I've spoken to have gone through the private system.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody. I know a few parents that have gone through the NHS, but I don't know anybody with adult ADHD that has gone through the NHS.
I guess it's just not seen as something that is life-threatening, and therefore NHS kind of backlogs it.
I don't think, it's not because it's not seen as life-threatening, it's because there are so many people on the waiting list.
Interesting.
So even if it was,
Yeah.
it still wouldn't, it would still take as long. Even general CAMS appointments, because you'd have to go, if you were getting a referral from a GP, you would have to go through CAMS. There's no specific ADHD diagnosis.
And I guess that is something that is a bit unique to the UK system, but it's probably global that quite a few people are wondering, do I have ADHD or not? I think it's really interesting what you're saying about the could this diagnosis even benefit me component of that, because when we look at the current treatments available for ADHD, they kind of suck, right? Like right now we give a lot of kids essentially low-grade amphetamines, like mild amphetamines, to essentially manage their ADHD. And
yeah. I think medication, and this is something that a lot of parents that we've spoken to struggle with.
Yeah.
And that puts them off getting a diagnosis of ADHD, because medicating a child is something that is incredibly serious. Well, medicating anybody is. You're looking at side effects and all sorts of things that you can't predict.
Yeah.
You can't predict the benefits of or the drawbacks. What is the net result going to be if you put someone on medication? And that's why getting a diagnosis is so important, and an accurate one. I don't know if you have seen you haven't seen the Panorama episode, but it came out and it was talked about a lot, about how, and this is something that we've seen when doing our market research as well, is that in private clinics, from my experience as well, talking to clinicians, we're talking about 80-90% of the patients that come through are diagnosed as positive.
Okay.
And so there's not a lot of data because they're not corroborated diagnosis, right? So we don't know why that is specifically. A lot of the anecdotal things that clinicians say is, if people are willing to pay that much for a diagnosis, they're pretty sure that their kid or they have it.
Yeah.
But that also feeds into, are we over-medicating people?
Yeah.
Which is why what we're trying to work on, and providing weight to an ADHD diagnosis is really important.
I mean, it's super biased, right? Because I could literally think I have ADHD. I go in to see a psychiatrist or whoever, and I just say, I think I have ADHD. And basically in 80 to 90% of the cases, the physician will just agree with me.
In private clinics, yeah.
In private clinics. But you're saying most of the times it is diagnosed in a private clinic, right? Because of the long waiting times in public healthcare systems, most of the times we are seeing individuals go to private clinics. And in those cases, most of the times they are just diagnosed with whatever they say they have, because you as like a private patient paying for this service, you don't want to go into seeing a doctor saying you have something and them saying you don't have it.
Yeah. I think it's important to note that that is the case. Why it is the case is up for debate. We don't know exactly.
It's qualitative, right? You're saying that in this diagnosis currently, what happens is you get asked a series of questions.
Yeah.
And it's very easy when you're asked a series of questions, A, for the question to bias your answer, and then B, to assume something at the end of it.
Yeah, but it's when a clinician makes that decision, they have to use their clinical judgment. So that's why it can't just be a questionnaire, like a set of questions and then yes, no. Like the importance of having a clinician involved is that they have to use their judgment. They have to explore each aspect of the question. They have to like go into like your childhood. They have to go into what your behavior is like if you're a child at school currently, or what your behavior is like at work or in your relationships. So it's not that easy as the clinician turns up and asks 30 questions. It's a clinical judgment. It's an analysis. And I think with the growth of remote medicine, and now we're seeing in it's not only remote medicine in like health in general, we're looking at remote medicine in mental health.
Yeah.
So we're seeing companies like Psychiatry UK or private clinicians who are independent practitioners giving diagnoses via Zoom. So having Zoom consultations. And I think from the Panorama episode, we saw that these consultations aren't as lengthy as the NHS ones. So they kind of, in that episode, they kind of compared NHS versus private clinics. And he went undercover and he did a consultation in a private clinic, and his appointment was 45 minutes long. And after that, he got a diagnosis.
Yeah.
Is that enough time to get a really in-depth view of somebody's life?
Yeah.
I don't know. But currently in the NICE guidelines, which is what clinicians have to use before they give a formal diagnosis, there's nothing to say about the length of time. We don't know that that's a factor, but I do think if you're going to give a diagnosis remotely, there needs to be, like, the more information we can give to clinicians to make that decision, the better, right? And the more likely we are to get towards a more accurate diagnosis.
And let's talk about the impact of overdiagnosis and overmedication for ADHD, right? What do we know about, the long-term use of amphetamines to manage ADHD? Why is it bad?
Yeah. I mean, it's not necessarily bad. It's like there's benefits and risks to everything. A lot of the anecdotal evidence of especially the kids that we've spoken to, parents are incredibly hesitant to put their child on medication. But once they do, I think there's been some parents that we've spoken to who've just talked about how their child went from failing in most of their subjects to being at the top of their class, to leading, like, one of the kids we spoke to, he's like 12 now, I think, and he is like spoken at the House of Lords on like an engineering project that he did. He's 12. Like, and before that, he was failing in most subjects and he was suffering with behavioural difficulties. So medication is not always bad. I think the public in general have a negative view on long-term medication. Like, we see it in everything, right? So if we could talk about like hypertension, for example, high blood pressure, it's all about making sure people are informed. The risks like the same thing, like it's like compliance with medication is incredibly important. With high blood pressure, if you don't take your medication, it can have really, really detrimental impacts to your life.
Yeah.
And it's the same with medication for mental health. There are other things you can do to support, but I think medication can have really, really good impacts if it's used correctly.
Yes. But here's the thing, right? Because we've heard stories like, you know, this child who can now speak at the House of Lords. I think often ADHD medication like Ritalin or Adderall are seen as, have you watched the Limitless movie where he has this pill, he takes this pill and now he's suddenly like amazing, like superhuman, like speed of thinking, right? I think a lot of the times because of these stories we hear in patients who actually have ADHD, in general, people become, you know, into this idea of taking Ritalin or Adderall to improve their performance, like Limitless. And so then they self-diagnose themselves with ADHD to get the prescription. Yeah. And I don't know if then that becomes an issue here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a long list of side effects for medications like Ritalin and Adderall. And these will present differently in patients in general. I think that it's if you give Adderall or Ritalin to somebody that doesn't have ADHD long term, or even if you give it to somebody who does, and you don't titrate it properly, so you don't maximize you don't get the dosing right. You can have like so many adverse effects on your behavior, on your moods, so many things, because it is a drug, like at the end of the day, and it doesn't have it's not like, it won't have a really specific this will happen to you if you take it and you don't have ADHD.
Yeah.
It's different for everybody because physiologically we're also different and we respond to things differently. So I think, it's just clearly not good to give somebody medication when they don't need it, and it's also not good to give them the wrong dose. And that's what will happen if people self-prescribe, right?
I see. And so with Clicks, is that essentially taking how we currently do diagnoses for ADHD and just making that digital? Or are you actually changing the way that we diagnose ADHD?
Yeah. So what we're trying to do to begin with is give clinicians more information. Mm-hmm. So, and if we can do that in a quantitative way, that's our aim. So there are certain, and that might not necessarily be like positive diagnosis or negative diagnosis.
Yeah.
It might be correlating with impairment. So can we give you more information about what type of ADHD this person has, or like how it might correlate to what difficulties they might present with in their life. So one aspect of ADHD diagnosis that occurs in the NHS mostly is, and in the States a lot they use it, is CPT. So that's quantitative testing to give you information on each of these parameters. So we're talking about, so it's things like reaction time. It tests your reaction time or omission commission accuracy. So 9 times out of 10, if there's a dot on the screen and I tell you don't click the dot, how many times do you actually click it when I've told you not to click it? And then the opposite, and then also reaction time. And at the moment, that is a really expensive thing for clinics to record. And there's not a lot of incentive for clinics to record that data because it's not required by the NICE guidelines. So legally, to give a diagnosis, private clinicians don't have to record that data. One of the methods that you use to test it costs £11,000. And so for an individual practitioner to use that, it's just not feasible because it doesn't maximize. And you've got to remember that private clinics are businesses, and so if they don't need to do it legally and it doesn't necessarily help clinicians get to a diagnosis, then they might not use it.
Yeah.
So we're trying to utilize the fact that that's available, and use machine learning and predictive models to maximize the results of those tests.
And to make it more accessible.
Yeah, exactly. So our main kind of, we want to make sure that it's accessible for a website or a phone, and we collect the data longitudinally. So we want to be able to track changes over time. Yeah, the core of what we're doing is we want a very data-driven approach, instead of adding more qualitative data. We're not trying to replace the clinician's judgment.
Yeah, just give them more information so that they can make the correct diagnoses. And then also, I guess, like, depending on the type of ADHD, that would also moderate the medication or treatment provided.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think if we think about private diagnosis, a reason that it can be so expensive and a better diagnosis will be more expensive is because it will take more time. And that time is required so that the doctor can make their clinical or it doesn't have to be a doctor that's making diagnoses.
Yeah.
It can be by the NICE guidelines, it's anybody with the relevant experience. And it categorizes that in a number of ways.
Just to summarize, CBT is currently a quantitative test used, and it costs around £11,000 to actually accurately diagnose ADHD. And the problem is the high costs mean that there are huge barriers to access for not just the UK, but other countries, developing countries, and the volume of patients that need to be diagnosed and to be medicated properly. And so essentially what you're doing is turning this existing diagnostic tool into something that is accessible, something that is cheaper with machine learning, and that more people can access and more clinicians can use to inform their decision making.
Yeah, exactly. And again, not necessarily just for diagnosis, but to give us more information in general, right?
And you're also in included VC, right? I wonder what your thoughts are on neurodivergence and how we can include founders with neurodivergent behavior. Because again, this topic was about, can ADHD be a superpower? Yes, I think it is, as you said, a disability, right? Ultimately, it characterizes itself in your non-ability to perform. But are there other areas where you see neurodivergence, actually can act as a superpower in a startup?
Yeah. So I think, one of the things that does happen with ADHD is the ability to hyperfocus. Patients kind of report being able to concentrate. So once they get into the flow of something, they really focus on the details of those things, and they're able to do that for a prolonged period of time. It's, as with all like neurodivergent conditions, it's a different way of thinking and it's a different way of viewing the world. And so when I was talking earlier about not competing, like that, if you do have this different view of the world, you cannot compete, because if you were to compete and do everything as everybody else was doing, you would lose. So if you, like, that perspective is, it can really, really be a benefit.
Because it forces you to think differently about the world.
Yeah, and because you get so used to having to find other ways around it. And I think that is so true for all disabilities.
Startups, yeah.
I mean, disabilities and startups. So my mum is disabled.
Yeah.
And that comes with a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
And so you can't compete because you have to spend a lot of your time taking care of somebody else. Or she can't compete because, and she struggled with getting work for a long time in the UK. And with challenges like that, because you can't compete, because you don't have the same starting point as everybody else, you find another way. And that kind of gets you away from the effort to reward, because no matter what she does, she can put the same effort in, she will not get the same reward. And so she has to think of a different way around. And that,
Interesting.
seeing that and being modeled that prepares you for being a founder, I think, because you've just accepted that like effort and reward isn't a thing.
I like that. And just to move forward into your journey with Clicks, can you tell me what the number one thing you would recommend someone doing if they want to be a health tech CEO? And what's an story or example you can share behind that?
Okay. I think being a founder whilst being a student, and especially a medical student, is incredibly isolating at medical school. And so we talk about being like not doing what everybody else is doing.
Yeah.
That is so true in medicine, because although we might see in the media like this person was a medical student or this person was a doctor and now they're like trying to become a founder, and that's increasing because of how the NHS is going and things are on pay, and like we work so hard and we don't get compensated, so the founder lifestyle isn't actually that unappealing.
Yeah.
So like with people who are like highly qualified in other careers and have like roots into corporate careers where they could be getting paid good money to do less hours, that isn't even an option for us, because if we go through medical school and become doctors, we will be putting in those hours anyway.
Yeah.
So being a founder isn't as scary as it is to other people. We're not giving up as much. We're giving up stability, that's for sure, and other things, but in that sense I think it's easier to kind of think about it tangibly. But even though we hear about it, in reality at medical school, people who will be thinking like you and that will actually take the first step to do something or put themselves out there is like completely unheard of. My cohort is 350.
Yeah.
Nobody understands why I'm doing this.
So is your number one thing to do is that like if you find that other person who gets you, like stick with them?
100%, but also don't wait for that person.
Don't wait for them.
I think, and I've had this conversation with a lot of founders of, do you need a co-founder? How do you find a co-founder? And I know that EF is very strong on you need a co-founder that complements you, otherwise you'll give up. And a lot of founders share that belief.
Yeah.
I think that although it's hard, if you want to do it, you just do it, and somewhere along your way,
You'll find the people.
you'll attract, right? And you will not, when you start, you will have absolutely nothing. And as soon as you start putting yourself out there, people will approach you. And if you never put yourself out there, no one's going to approach you. And you have absolutely nothing to lose. And I think people often kind of hyperinflate in their heads, especially medical students, where time is such an important thing for us. If I do this and it fails, then like I've lost the time that I could have been using to do really well in my degree. Which
they kind of factor out the learning component of it.
Exactly, because the learning component is not tangible.
Yeah.
So the things that you learn along the way, or the conversations that you have, or the people that you meet, they don't translate into a grade or a certificate.
Yeah. Into a gold sticker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like in a lot of cases, they don't even translate onto your CV. How do you put that on your CV? You know?
I see. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So I guess the number one thing to do is just to go for it, you know, whether or not you find that other person, whether it is going to be isolating or not, whether you get the certificate or not, just do it to learn.
100%. And I think what I would say to someone starting out now is to really, and I know everybody says this, like been said to death, but start with your problem that you're trying to solve. Really, really understand your problem, because your solution might not work, but if you still have your problem, that gives you a direction by proxy.
Yeah.
If you start with a solution, you are going to be so lost if it doesn't work, because you're never going to reach your like product market fit, because it's not centered around the market, which is the people that you're trying to
help.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, what is the number one thing not to do? And can you give an example of something that's happened or a story?
Okay, I have so many. There are so many things.
Yeah.
And I think as soon as you put yourself out there, the first thing you will do when you put yourself out there is you will make a mistake. That's the first thing you will do. And then you'll learn how to fix your mistake. And then you'll do that over and over again. Yeah, so things not to do. Don't start with your solution.
Yeah.
We were so focused on CPT because we knew that this was a problem.
Yeah.
That we didn't look at the magnitude of solution, because how can you look at the magnitude of a solution without looking at the problem, right? So we had this really great technology, and we were so excited by that we kind of got lost on our problem. And then you have to start again. But I think that teaches you something as well, because you get really used to being like, okay, cool, no, this isn't working. Let's go back. And you have to be really like strong on that and really certain, because if you keep pushing in a direction that you're unsure of, you'll just go further towards the wrong direction. Like, you have to be constantly reassessing. It's kind of interesting because it's similar to medicine. So when we're doing like our emergency algorithm, where we're going through someone's like airway, breathing, circulation, every stage we do the tests, we check for signs, and then we reassess. We go back and we say, did we actually make impact? Are we going in the right direction? And then you move on only if you've reassessed at every point.
So that kind of finding the product market fit is similar to the assessment in medicine.
Yeah, I think so.
And finally, what is the number one impact you want to leave on the world with Clicks?
I just want people to have more access to mental health care, treatment and diagnosis. So I also think if we can find a way that is easier to give this to people, because not everybody has that much money to get a diagnosis in the first place.
Yeah.
And also not, as in the repercussions for getting a diagnosis that isn't accurate or being on medication that they don't need is massive. And I think that people shouldn't have to go into it with so much risk, because that puts them off going and getting a diagnosis even more. So whether you think you have it or not, you should have the ability to confirm and have kind of that. You need to be able to have that validation in yourself. Like, I know that I do, or I don't have it, and I know the things that I can do to improve my life. And that's what I want to see for mental health in general.